listeners, I will be continuing the reading of Love Lucy by Lucille Ball. Chapter 1. I am a Leo. I was born on a Sunday, August 6, 1911. Unfortunately, everybody knows my birth date because I told the truth when I first came to Hollywood. I grew up not on the sidewalks of New York City, as some people think, but in the beautiful resort area of Lake Chautauqua, New York, near the green, wooded Allegheny wilderness. I used to say I was born in Butte, Montana. I thought it sounded more glamorous than Western New York. I was conceived in Montana when my father was working for his father as a lineman at Independent Telephone Company in Anaconda. But I was born in my grandparents' apartment on Stewart Street in Jamestown, New York, where I was delivered by my grandmother, Flora Bell Hunt. My mother, Desiree Hunt, or Dee Dee as we call her, was of French-English descent, with a touch of Irish from her father's side that showed in her porcelain-fine English complexion and auburn hair. Dee Dee was so talented musically that she could have been a fine concert pianist, but at 17 she met and married a local Jamestown boy, my father, Henry Durrell Ball. As soon after my birth as my mother could travel, she insisted we return to Montana and Henry. Henry was tall, with intense, penetrating blue eyes. He was a wonderful guy, according to everyone who knew him, full of fun, with a good comic sense. Dee Dee says I got my sense of humor from him. People are always asking me if Ball is my real name. As a young model, I tried being Diane Belmont for a while, but that kind of phony elegance wasn't for me. All I know about the Ball side of my family is that they are descended from an English family, which owned houses and lands, and had for sure, in some early period, there were Ball mariners, hunters, priests, and barons, but it appears no actors. As for the American branch of the family, there was some Ball blood in George Washington. His mother's maiden name was Mary Ball. Ball family records place them in New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Massachusetts, and I found gravestones of several Balls on Arthur Godfrey's farm in Virginia when we visited him last spring. For almost 4 years, I was an only child. My young parents showered me with affection. I was at the center of the stage. Life was a lark. Dee Dee tried dressing me in ribbons and bows, but I rebelled, never being the prissy doll type. My father roughhoused me, as he might with a boy, tossing me to the ceiling and catching me a few feet from the floor, and giving me piggybacks. I screamed with delight while Dee Dee worried about the tomboy she was raising. I'm known among comedians as a stunt girl who will do anything. Red Skelton flatters me by saying I have the courage of a tiger. I don't think it's a matter of bravery, it's just doing what comes naturally. I do know that if an actress has the slightest aversion to pie in the face or pratfalls, the camera will pick it up instantly. The audience won't laugh, they'll suffer in sympathy. Perhaps my willingness to be knocked off a 20-foot pedestal or shot down a steamship funnel goes back to my earliest, happiest days with my father. I knew he was going to catch me. I wasn't going to get hurt. Dee Dee says that I adored my young father. When I was about 3, she got tired of the 40-below Montana winters and homesick for the gentle green hills of home. So eastward we went to Wyandotte, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, where my father became foreman of a telephone line crew. Late one day the following January, my father caught the grip and went to bed. Several days later, a whopper of a sleet storm hit Detroit. Being a highly conscientious guy, my father bundled up to get the crews and payroll out. Despite his His grip turned into typhoid fever. He died not long after that storm. He was only 28, and my mother was almost 23. I was not yet 4, but I remember vividly the moment she told me Daddy was gone. I could tell you where the tables were, where the windows were, what they looked out on, where the bed was. And I remember that at that very moment, a picture suddenly fell from the wall, and I noticed on the kitchen windowsill some little gray sparrows feeding. I've been superstitious about birds ever since. I've heard that birds flying in the window are supposed to bring bad luck. I don't have a thing about live birds, but pictures of birds get me. I won't buy anything with a print of a bird, and I won't stay in a hotel room with bird pictures or bird wallpaper. From Wyandotte, on a cold March morning, we returned to Jamestown with my father's coffin, and Dee Dee says I showed very little emotion until the funeral service. As they lowered his coffin into the ground and began filling in his grave, she says I let out a blood-curdling scream she'll never forget and wouldn't stop until she carried me away. After that, my mother and I returned to her parents' home in Jamestown. The next few years were very difficult ones for Dee Dee. She had practically no money, and her parents had little to spare. I think she was a little stunned by her unhappy circumstances. I can remember her shaking her head, saying softly, "Married before I was 18, a mother before I was 19, and widowed before I was 23. The future must have looked very bleak to her. She had been deeply in love with my father. I know she missed him very much." Dee Dee's parents, my grandfather and grandmother Hunt, were then living in a small place on Buffalo Street in Jamestown. Their only son, my Uncle Harold, had died of tuberculosis just a few years before, when he was only 18. They hadn't yet recovered from that loss, so when Dee Dee gave birth to a fine baby boy 4 months after my father's death, they were overjoyed. My brother arrived on Saturday, July 17th, 1915, and was christened Fred Henry after Grandpa Hunt, who passed out cigars at the furniture factory that day and boasted to everyone about his fine boy, Freddie. He really thought of Freddie as his very own. I was largely ignored, and I became very jealous. It's always hard to go from being an only child to having an infant sibling in the house. Since my father had just died, I'm sure I was particularly sensitive to the great fuss that was made over the new baby. Dee Dee must have remembered that because in 1953, when friends poured into our house with presents for little Desi, she stood by the front door and reminded them to be sure to say hello to little Lucy first. I remember feeling jealous about Freddie, but it, of course, wasn't his fault. He was a calm and level-headed little boy, cooperative and hardworking. He took good care of all his belongings and never broke anything of mine. He never strayed far from home either, or caused anybody concern or worry. I was the tomboy and the daredevil, not Freddie. By the time I was 12 and Freddie was 8, I adored him and have never changed my mind. After Freddie's birth, my mother became more and more depressed, so finally it was decided that she should go to California for a complete change of scene. Freddie stayed with my mother's parents, while I was sent to live with my Aunt Lola, my mother's younger sister. Lola was a plump, blossomy, easygoing woman who ran the best beauty shop in town. She had just married a Greek named George Mantikos. George had been born and raised in Greece and spoke with an intriguing accent. He was the first Mediterranean type in my life, and he fascinated me. With my father dead and me now separated from my mother, I naturally fell madly in love with Uncle George. My aunt and uncle were still honeymooning during this time. Distracted by each other, they couldn't have cared less whether I got to school or not. So most days I spent in my aunt's beauty shop or following Uncle George. Once again, I was an only child with a mother and a shortly, shaking his hand free of my vice-like grip. And that's the way it was. Ed was never mean or abusive, but his presence in the house was shadowy. We barely had time to get acquainted with him before he and Dee Dee went off to Detroit to look for jobs, leaving me and Freddie behind. My brother stayed with our doting grandparents while I was parceled out to Ed's parents, the Petersons. Nothing had ever prepared me for such hard, sour, cheerless people. And since the Petersons were both quite elderly, I'm sure they were about as pleased as I was by our new living arrangements. Having accepted the responsibility, Grandma Peterson was not one to shirk her duty. She had been born in Sweden, and her attitude toward the free and easy ways of America was one of distrust and suspicion. A devout Christian, she strove to keep her life and mine free from indulgences. Anything that gave pleasure lapsed into one of the 7 deadly sins, and was therefore devil's bait. Nothing in this life was ever to be enjoyed, only endured. Grandma Peterson took me to Sunday school regularly, and I remember a lot of talk of fire and brimstone there. Punishments were frequent, and to me unreasonable, since I never got a satisfactory explanation of my crimes. My grandmother complained to the Hunts that I was difficult and headstrong. She told me that I was a nervous child, and sassy and bold and silly, and why not? I had so little outlet for my physical energies. My usual punishment was solitary confinement in my room, or being sent to bed before the sun went down in summertime, when I could hear the happy shouts of other children playing outdoors. Grandma Peterson saw to it that Satan found no mischief for my idle hands. She bought linen toweling by the yard and had me roll the edges by hand, finicky work that made me want to jump out of my skin. Another chore was darning the Peterson hose, which were as thick as a horse blanket. I was taught to knit and crochet. This last skill took. I still crochet with great enjoyment, everything from baby booties to coverlets for beds. Washing dishes was a daily chore, and how I hated it. The kitchen was small and dark, and the sink so high I had to stand on a box to reach it. The only light came from one weak gas jet. The water was heated on top of the stove and soon became lukewarm and greasy. After Grandmother Peterson inspected the finished job, she often made me start all over. In retrospect, learning those domestic skills certainly didn't hurt me, and later on, my own mother kept me at chores until I did them right. But where the Petersons made housework a grim chore, at the Hunts, we kids got a sense of cozy togetherness from pitching in. There were some small advantages to the harsh, isolated life I led with the Petersons. I used to welcome a rainy day. Then I was allowed to play with my clothespin dolls in a corner of the back porch. I can close my eyes and still see the leaden sky, the rain splashing off the porch roof, the bright green maple leaves clinging together like wet crepe paper, and I can hear my involved conversations with these dolls. Curiously enough, Grandmother Peterson had a green thumb, and I have her to thank for my great love for flowers, especially spring flowers. Somewhere inside her, there must have been a well of maternal tenderness which found expression in the way she pruned and prayed over and tended her roses, her prized dahlias, the bulbs she brought indoors during the winter and set it again in the spring. I don't suppose that hard work, discipline, and a perfectionist attitude toward my work did me any harm. They are a big part of my makeup today, as any of my coworkers will tell you. And when life seemed unbearable, I learned to live in my imagination and to step inside other people's skins, indispensable abilities for an actress. On the other hand, I have my grandmother Peterson to thank for the gnawing sense of unworthiness and insecurity that haunted me for years. The Puritan idea that everything pleasurable is somehow one-sided. Having her back again was just about the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Dee Dee still feels guilty about the time we were apart, but I understand that circumstances forced our separation, and she certainly has made up for it with unflagging devotion ever since. When we speak of the slights of our childhood, it's hard to remember that often people were struggling to do their level best. This knowledge comes to you later in life, of course, when you have children of your own. Once we were all back together again with Grandma and Grandpa Hunt, everything straightened out magically. Dee Dee still had to work full-time, but my grandparents were home quite a lot. I have them to thank for most of the happy times of my childhood. My grandfather Hunt began life as the only son of a well-to-do Jamestown hotel owner. Grandpa Hunt worked in his father's hotel, then ran a grocery store in Jamestown, and was also a postman, a maker of optical instruments, and a chiropractor. Some people called him Doctor from his brief brush with the last calling. He kept his old chiropractor's leather couch, and neighbors soon learned how his strong fingers could ease an aching back. He was also a skilled wood turner. When I was quite young, this is how he earned his living in one of Jamestown's fine furniture plants. Grandfather Fred had a jaunty air about him, with bright blue eyes and sandy hair that kept its color even into his 70s. He was at once cunning, cute, cocky, and wonderfully good to us kids. He met and married my grandmother, Flora Bell Orcutt, when she was a chambermaid in his father's hotel. The Orcutts had farmed for several generations in the rolling green countryside around Charlotte Center, a crossroads about 20 miles from Jamestown. They were strong, sturdy folk with the earthy good sense that comes from tending animals and tilling the soil. I can still remember some of those wonderful meals we had around the Orcutts' groaning board. Flora Bell was one of 5 sets of twins and was orphaned at an early age. At one time, the children were about to be sent to an orphanage, and Flora Bell, although she was not the oldest, lost no time in getting all her 9 brothers and sisters under the same roof. They've all held her in great respect. Grandmother Flora Bell was very beautiful, with good bone structure, curly salt and pepper hair, a trim figure, and good legs. Her hands were also very shapely, with long fingers, but red and roughened from hard work and the strong solutions she used as a practical nurse. She was just about the best midwife in Jamestown, and was much in demand. Flora Bell was a dedicated nurse with a very open, welcoming attitude toward the world. Always cooking, cleaning, sewing, she was a sunny, active, vigorous woman, a dreamer and a planner. Nothing was too much for her, no hours too long, no time better spent than doing things for her family. Grandmother Hunt didn't have much formal education, and she hung on grandfather's every word. He was the bookish type, interested in words and their derivations, and fond of reading aloud. Sometimes it was poetry, and sometimes politics, or a book like Black Beauty, which he read to us kids. Grandmother would come into the room and sit quietly sewing as she listened. I remember the scratchy sound her work and rough fingers made as she handled scraps of silk for her quilts. Sometimes, if the story he read was a sad one, tears would slip down her soft cheeks, falling on the silk in her lap. My grandparents had little money, but they gave us a richly satisfying family life. I was 8.5 years old when we all moved into the little 3-bedroom house on 8th Street in Celeron, which held first 2, then 3 families. I loved every inch of that weathered shingled house. It had a front porch and a back shed and a small dark front parlor separated from the front hall by portieres. These were the stage curtains for our innumerable productions as Freddie and I grew up. My bedroom was in the rear, overlooking the big backyard with its bedspreads, discarded curtains, bits of chicken feathers, ribbon, and lace all found their way into that drawer and were happily put to use. No sooner were both families cozily under one roof than Aunt Lola gave birth to a daughter with the expert help of Grandmother Florabelle. Since Aunt Lola had a beauty shop to run, her daughter Cleo stayed with us and became our baby. Cleo had great dark eyes, black curly hair, plump dimpled little knees, and her mother's good humor. As soon as she could walk, she was added to our repertory company. I would dress her, make her up, and rehearse our lines with her. Since all the adult members of the household worked, I seldom went anywhere without Freddie hanging on to one hand and Cleo the other. For as jealous as I was of Freddie at his birth, it wasn't long before I'd completely taken him under my wing. Not only was he a level-headed and hard-working little boy, he was an amiable co-star in all our homespun productions. Many of the inspirations for our stage plays came from the fine productions we saw on summer evenings at Celeron Amusement Park, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump from our house across a daisy field and a railroad track. The park was built by the owners of Jamestown's Worsted Mills and Street Railways at the turn of the century. To us, it was as unique and wonderful as Disneyland is today, with its Calliope, Ferris wheel, and merry-go-round. Many wealthy Pittsburgh oil families built summer homes on Lake Chautauqua, and Dee Dee could remember when they came to the park dressed to the teeth, riding shiny carriages with matched chestnuts and liveried grooms. Back then, there was a lake steamer which brought in boatloads from the world-famous Chautauqua Institute at the northern end of the lake. Sousa performed in the bandshell, and Pauline McLean performed in Mrs. Wiggs at the Cabbage Patch in the summer. She stayed in a rented house in Celeron. I used to hang around outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of my idol. One morning, she threw open the window and stood there, shaking out her sheets and blankets, in curlers and a dust cap. That was a disillusioning sight. There was no admission fee to the park, and any summer evening, we could stroll over and watch the fountains of colored water, or the spectacular fireworks, or see the perils of Pauline on the flickering outdoor screen. A man named Rex, who sported black tights, made balloon accessions in a little basket. After hovering for a while, he parachuted to the park, and sometimes, if the wind was strong, into the lake. When its load of gas was spent, the balloon would come down, and there was a reward for anyone who found it. I can still picture it streaking down from the sky like a long black cigar. Celeron got its name from a French explorer, a Comte de Celeron. In the late 18th century, he paddled down the 20-mile lake Chautauqua and landed at the southern end of the lake, which thereafter was known as Celeron. Next, the British claimed the land, and then the Americans. Most of the early settlers in the area came from New England. The Puritan heritage is deep in my blood. My dearest dream is to live in a little white house in New England with a lilac bush by the front door. My husband Gary calls me one of the Eskimo people. He dotes on sunshine and hot weather and hates the snow and ice. We really had blizzards in Celeron. The lake froze solid a mile across and was covered with ice skaters and ice boats and ice fishermen. I'd love to live in New England, where I could have that bright, clear air and clean snow and change of seasons. There's another New England thing about me, and that's a strong conservative Puritan streak. I've always known right from wrong, and I like to know how I learned this, to make sure my kids do. I'm the most conservative member of my family. Grandfather Freddie was a progressive and free thinker. Dee Dee was a product of the roaring 20s. She believed in letting go and expressing yourself. Bang your fist and let your feelings out. She never gave a fig what other people said or thought. My mother gave us kids freedom and was permissive. Dee Dee says she knew what stuff we were made of and trusted us. I do know that growing up right next to the amusement park can be very bad. Some of the kids ran wild there, and although I appreciated the magic of the place and the spell of make-believe it cast, it's hard to develop a real sense of values growing up next to a commercial carnival. But apparently I profited from this experience. I am not easily taken in by anyone. The little red brick Celeron schoolhouse, which we attended from kindergarten through high school, was just a half a block from our house. I was lucky to grow up in a regular little United Nations, kids of old Anglo-Saxon stock and kids whose fathers or grandfathers came from Italy, Albania, Greece, Germany, Poland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Jamestown is a great furniture center, and skilled woodworkers came there from all over the world, so many of my classmates had fathers who were highly skilled craftsmen. Like my grandfather, they took great pride in their work. Grandfather had a little workshop at home where he made us all kinds of things. He built us sleds and wagons and wheelbarrows and stilts, pogo sticks, swings, teeter-totters, and tree houses. And just for me, he made the most absolutely marvelous doll furniture, some of which I still treasure. Using fine pieces of cherry and walnut and mahogany, he turned and scrolled the tiny posts of doll beds and chair legs. Gradually, mass production methods displaced the old, slow, careful, finicky ways of making fine furniture. My grandfather learned to run a lathe, but he missed the satisfaction of transforming a piece of wood into something of elegance and beauty with his own hands. He wound up as a factory worker before the days of the unions and saw many abuses of authority. And because he was an idealist, a sincere humanitarian, he became a follower of socialist leader Eugene Debs, the fiery defender of all the underdogs. I remember the glorious day in Celeron when the indoor bathtub arrived. We already had an indoor bathroom with a toilet, to put it indelicately, but no tub since we had no hot water. Saturday night baths meant heating the water on the big iron wood-burning kitchen stove. When we were small, I got first turn in the galvanized washtub, followed by Freddie. In the summertime, Grandfather wouldn't let us go swimming in Lake Chautauqua without taking along a cake of soap for shampooing our hair and washing all over. So we really felt like celebrating when hot water in a tub finally arrived. It was a new luxury to soak and scrub in privacy. We kids always called Grandfather Hunt Daddy and kept calling him that to the end of his days. He was our daddy in the sense that he was the man of the household whom we loved and obeyed. He was great on discipline, and if you didn't hop to it at once, wham, you got it. Once I dilly-dallied too long getting to the dinner table, and Daddy spanked me with the gravy spoon, with gravy still on it. There was hot chicken gravy all over the dining room and my Sunday dress, too. The great thing about my grandfather Hunt was that he took such good care of everything. He taught us the same pride of ownership. Once I slid down the coal bin in the cellar, tearing my dress and ruining my white shoes with coal dust. I really got it good. That cellar was fascinating to me, mysterious, and at the same time, so planned and orderly. There were the empty boxes left over from one Christmas, waiting for the next, the fragrance of freshly cut wood, rows of grandmother's canning, the damp smell of the earth floor. Eggs were kept in a pottery crock. It was kind of spooky, reaching down into the cold brine, getting wet to the elbow. And those dang spiders, how I hated them. Snakes would crawl in there, too. Look, Daddy would say, picking one up. It's just a garter snake, don't you see? He's harmless. Of course, there were rattlesnakes and copperheads in the area, and he taught us to recognize them, too, as he taught us to know the poisonous kinds of mushrooms. Daddy's truck garden drew admirers for miles around. He kept us in fresh vegetables and berries all summer, and the rest was canned for good eating all cellar and hid them down there. Then some evening, when we were all upstairs, she would cry at the cellar door. When one of us let her out, she'd carry her brood up one by the scruff of the neck so we could admire them. While Cleo was still a baby, Grandmother Florabelle gave up a lot of her nursing jobs and stayed home to look after her. But then Grandmother's health began to fail, and looking after the younger kids and getting supper on the table became my responsibility. I couldn't understand why Grandmother's nerves would sometimes snap, but her pain and our racket must have been unbearable at times. Dee Dee said that I had to practice the piano for 1 hour every afternoon after school. She was a wonderful pianist and insisted that I had music in me, and that's where it stayed, in me. Grandmother used to encourage me to practice too, but once she fell ill, my playing only seemed to irritate her. I just couldn't understand the change in my beloved grandmother. Then one day I learned that she had uterine cancer and wasn't going to get well. She got weaker and weaker. Toward the end, she lay all the time in her big mahogany bed in the front parlor. Grandmother Hunt wasted away. When she died, released from the last of her suffering, I was not allowed to go to the funeral. I took little Cleo and Freddie by the hand and followed the funeral procession down the street, crying my heart out. Grandmother Hunt was only 51 when she died. Because of her, I have a special place in my heart for cancer research. Although she knew her own case was hopeless, she prayed to the end for a cure for others. Each Memorial Day, we would cut great branches of blooming lilacs from the purple bushes in the backyard and carry them to Lakeview Cemetery to Grandmother's grave. Since those days, lilac has become almost an obsession with me. Someone once interpreted my passion for it as signaling a return to the womb, to Celeron, to the innocent happiness of childhood. Whatever the reason, the emotional tug is so overwhelming that I've been known to plan trips to New England in May just to see and smell the lilac in bloom. It's difficult to grow in California, although I've been trying for many years. There are actually male and female bushes, although nobody seems able to tell them apart. We just plant them all together in the sunniest corner of the garden and hope. This year they bloom for the very first time. They don't have the fragrance of lilacs in the east, of course. Still, I was delighted. After Grandmother Hunt died, there was no adult in the house during the day. I suddenly found myself in her shoes at the age of 11. Freddie was then 7 and Cleo 3. Dee Dee was certainly a powerful example of a woman's dedication to her family. She could seldom get home from her job selling hats until 6 or 6:30, including Saturdays. So it was my job to make the beds, do the dusting, make sure the table was set, cook dinner, and do the supper dishes. Then Dee Dee would be up past midnight scrubbing and ironing clothes, mending and sewing. She had 2 dresses to her name, both black, which she kept brushed and clean and wore with white collars or pearls. At this time, Dee Dee was 30, still a handsome woman with an infectious laugh. Selling hats was tedious work. My mother was on her feet long hours, and the pay was low. She never complained and always put on a good front, but we knew how the fatigue and worry of making ends meet aggravated her excruciating migraine headaches. I'm a headache sufferer myself, so I know what she went through, but luckily for me, today headaches can be better controlled. I could still see Dee Dee now on Sunday afternoons parceling her weekly earnings into little envelopes. There would be $1.25 for insurance, or $4 for a new clothes washer, or $2 for a new set of porch furniture, everything bought on time. But I had the most beautiful clothes of any kid in school. I was always the first with the latest, be it a raccoon coat, open galoshes, or the blue serge midi blouse to go with my short boyish bob. Dee Dee always wanted the best for her children. so you're smoking now, she remarked pleasantly. Let's have one together. She kept me inhaling one cigarette after another until I turned purple and then green. I was 18 before I tried smoking again. Aunt Lola often let me help out in her beauty shop. I'd operate on the customers' children, frizzing their hair with a smoking hot marcel iron and nicking their ears with the shingling shears. I think I actually put Aunt Lola out of business. The children's irate mothers just refused to come near the place. Ultimately, Aunt Lola closed up shop and went into nursing. However, I still love everything about the beauty business. I have a room full of hairdressing equipment and give permanents, hair sets, manicures, and pedicures to this day. Only now I'm good at it. When she left to enter nurse's training, Aunt Lola also got a divorce from my Uncle George. He moved away and out of our lives, and Cleo stayed with us. She was a cuddly, affectionate child who often crawled into Dee Dee's bed or lap to be comforted. Our pet name for her was Cleo Baby. Freddie was Fritzy Boy. I was Lucille. What the hell are you doing now? Among the things that made life interesting in Celeron were the train wrecks. The Erie tracks ran around the lake from Mayville, the county seat to the north, and passed just a few hundred yards from our house. One day, Mrs. Curtis, the only wealthy member of our community, got stuck on the tracks in her electric car. She lived in a big stucco house, which took up the whole block, surrounded by a high fence. She was a mysterious person to us kids, since we knew so little about her. Apparently, she was slightly deaf, for she never heard the train coming before the collision. The car was demolished, but Mrs. Curtis merely injured. The train conductors loaded her into the baggage car and chugged off to Jamestown and the hospital. At the scene of the wreck, I found some amber beads. I toyed with the idea of keeping them, but in the end, honesty prevailed. After Mrs. Curtis got home from the hospital, I marched through her impressive front gate and rang the doorbell. She turned out to be a sweet and charming lady. She gave me the most thrilling gift I had ever received, a reward for returning the beads, a real gold wristwatch. Another time, an Erie freight car became uncoupled and rode up over the flat car in front. There was a tremendous crash and sound of splintering wood as 25 freight cars toppled off the track. People came pouring out of their homes, and so did I, but not empty-handed. I bounded across the field with a bucket of water in each hand. No homeless tramp was going to burn up in one of those freight cars if I could help it. Being the eldest, I had to keep track of the two younger kids. Luckily, they were both easy to manage and seldom got into mischief. Dee Dee really loaded me with heavy responsibilities, but more important, she trusted me to make the right decisions. My childhood was challenging, but not back-breaking. Dee Dee set the challenges, and I pretty much met them and grew stronger. People with happy childhoods never overdo. They don't strive or exert themselves. They're moderate, pleasant, well-liked, and good citizens. Society needs them, but the tremendous drive and dedication necessary to succeed in any field, not only show business, often seems to be rooted in a disturbed childhood. I wasn't an unloved or unwanted child, but I was moved around a lot, and then death and cruel circumstances brought many painful separations. My adolescence was about as stormy as you might imagine. I had a red-headed temper, though no red hair in those days. Cleo remembers me as a creative, strong-willed teenager, whirling like a pinwheel. I can remember kicking, rolling, biting fights on the school grounds. There were some girls I certainly had some rounds with, and a few boys, too. There was an Italian typing teacher I was crazy about, but once she made me so mad, I threw a typewriter at her. It takes me a long time to get angry, but when I do, it's such a compilation of things over a long period that nobody can quite understand what triggered it finally, even myself. There's a great deal of difference between temperament and temper. Temperament is something you welcome creatively